The day started just like any other for Marcus. He was a well-dressed man in his early 30s, with a briefcase in hand, walking briskly down a busy street in the city. His mind was focused on the meeting ahead, a huge opportunity that could change his career. He had worked tirelessly to get to this point, and today could be the moment that made everything worthwhile. His briefcase, packed with important papers, contained everything he needed for the meeting. Documents that represented years of hard work and determination. The city was alive with activity. People rushed to work, street vendors shouted out their deals, and cars honked as they moved through the busy intersection. Marcus kept his head down, walking quickly to avoid being late. But as he neared a corner, he felt a sudden presence behind him. A voice called out, "Excuse me, sir." It was a police officer. Marcus turned around to see a white officer standing there, his hand resting on the side of his belt. The officer looked him up and down, his eyes narrowing. "I need to ask you a few questions," the officer said, his tone firm but not unfriendly. Marcus stopped and gave the officer a nod. He was in a hurry, but he also knew the importance of staying calm during encounters like this. The officer glanced at his briefcase. "What's in there?" "Mind if I take a look?" he asked, gesturing toward the leather bag. Marcus felt a tight knot in his stomach. The briefcase contained personal and confidential documents, papers related to the high-profile job he had recently resigned from. He had carefully organized everything, thinking only about the upcoming meeting. But now, this officer wanted to take a look. "No, I don't mind," Marcus replied, trying to hide his growing unease. He understood the concept of routine checks, but something about this interaction felt off. He could sense that the officer wasn't just asking out of curiosity. There was something more beneath the surface. Still, Marcus remained calm. "I'm in a rush," he added, hoping that would speed things up. The officer didn't respond immediately. Instead, he stepped closer and started to unzip the briefcase. Marcus didn't expect what happened next. Rather than just inspecting a few papers, the officer began to flip through the contents as though searching for something. Marcus opened his mouth to protest but stopped. It wasn't that he didn't have the right to say no, but something told him that pushing back might make the situation worse. His eyes followed the officer's hand as it sifted through his work files, legal papers, and confidential documents, none of which were meant for anyone but Marcus to see. At that moment, Marcus felt a sense of vulnerability that he had never experienced before. He wasn't just dealing with a random stranger. This was a police officer, someone with authority, and that authority had been wielded against him without warning. The officer's eyes paused as he pulled out a set of documents that immediately stood out. Marcus couldn't see what they said, but the officer's expression changed. The papers seemed to make the officer uncomfortable. His face, which had been neutral up until that point, shifted into one of uncertainty, as though he had just discovered something he wasn't supposed to find. For a brief moment, Marcus felt the weight of the situation. This wasn't just an ordinary encounter anymore. Whatever the officer had found, it wasn't good. But Marcus didn't know what was going to happen next. He stood there, his heart pounding, as the officer continued to examine the papers in silence. The officer didn't speak for a few moments, his eyes scanning the papers he had pulled from Marcus's briefcase. Marcus stood there, trying to remain calm, but inside, a whirlwind of thoughts raced through his mind. He couldn't shake the feeling that something had gone terribly wrong. The officer's hands trembled slightly as he flipped through the documents, his face growing paler with each page he saw. Marcus felt his stomach drop. He tried to stay composed, but his mind couldn't help but race. What had the officer found? What was so troubling about these papers? The documents were important, but they were also private. They were legal agreements, personal correspondence, and some highly confidential information about a project he had worked on for years. The meeting he was rushing to was about a new job offer, but it also contained key information that could impact his entire career. The officer's expression shifted from casual curiosity to something darker, almost fearful. Marcus could see that the officer was no longer just inspecting the contents. He was studying them closely, and he didn't seem to understand what he was looking at. There was a sudden tension in the air that made Marcus feel as though he was standing on the edge of a cliff. "Are these your papers?" the officer finally asked, his voice quieter than before. His eyes remained fixed on the documents in his hand, not looking at Marcus. "Yes, they're mine," Marcus said, trying to sound confident, but his voice came out a little shakier than he intended. He had no idea what the officer was seeing, but he knew this wasn't normal. He had been through enough professional environments to recognize when something was seriously off. The officer hesitated. Then, without looking up, he asked, "What exactly is in these?" Marcus wanted to scream at him to give the papers back, but he didn't want to escalate things further. The officer was already acting suspicious, and Marcus couldn't help but wonder if this was the beginning of something that could ruin his career. For a few moments, the officer didn't respond. He just kept flipping through the documents. Marcus was growing more and more uneasy by the second. He could feel the eyes of people nearby, some who were watching quietly, others who were now starting to take out their phones. Marcus knew they were recording the encounter. The last thing he wanted was to be caught up in something that could make him a public spectacle. The officer's next words shattered the silence. These are serious," he muttered, almost to himself. "This is big." Marcus's mind raced as he tried to make sense of what the officer meant. What could he possibly have found that was so big? He had worked hard to gather the documents for this meeting, and they contained sensitive information about a company he had worked with. But nothing in those papers should have been enough to cause such a reaction. It was only when the officer's eyes met Marcus's that he understood. This wasn't just about the documents. There was something far deeper at play. The officer stepped back slightly, looking at Marcus as though he were seeing him for the first time. The expression on his face had changed completely. What started as suspicion had shifted into something else: fear, confusion, or maybe even guilt. The officer seemed to realize that he had stumbled upon something much larger than he could handle. Marcus stood there, heart pounding, his thoughts still racing. He had no idea what the officer was thinking, but he could tell that whatever it wasn't good. It was like a switch had been flipped, and the whole situation had turned upside down. What had the officer just discovered in those papers? And what was he going to do next? The officer stood there, staring at the documents in his hands, almost as if he were lost in thought. His face had drained of color, and his hand, still holding the papers, shook slightly. Marcus could feel the weight of the silence pressing down on him. He knew this wasn't just any ordinary search anymore. Something had changed in the air. The officer had found something he didn't expect, and it was clear that whatever it was big. For a moment, neither of them spoke. Marcus glanced at the officer, trying to read his expression, but it was impossible. His face was a mask of uncertainty, and he seemed almost afraid to speak. The officer glanced up at Marcus, his eyes wide, as if realizing just how serious the situation had become. The officer's voice faltered. "This is serious," he repeated, his words barely above a whisper. His gaze shifted nervously between the documents and Marcus, as if he were trying to figure out how to explain what he had found, or perhaps how to react to it. Marcus's mind was spinning. He couldn't understand what the officer meant by that. What exactly had he discovered? He knew the papers he was carrying were sensitive. They contained critical documents related to his former job, and some legal matters. But there was nothing in them that should have caused such a reaction. He tried to keep his voice steady as he spoke again, this time with more urgency. "Look, I don't know what you think you found, but I need those back," Marcus said, his voice firm but controlled. He didn't want to escalate things, but he couldn't stand there any longer, waiting for the officer to make up his mind. He had a meeting to get to, and this whole encounter was only wasting time. The officer didn't respond immediately. He simply stared at the papers in his hands, his brow furrowed in confusion. He seemed to be weighing his next move carefully, unsure of what to do next. Marcus could see that the officer was completely out of his depth. He wasn't acting like someone who was confident in his role anymore. Instead, he looked like someone who had just realized he had made a huge mistake. After a long pause, the officer spoke again, his voice low and hesitant. I need to check something. Just stay right here, he said, his eyes darting toward his radio, which was clipped to his belt. Marcus, now even more nervous than before, nodded silently. He had no choice but to wait. His mind was racing. The documents the officer had found weren't just any legal papers. They were a part of an ongoing investigation into a corporate scandal. Marcus had been approached by a reporter just days earlier, asking for his help to expose some questionable practices at his former company. The reporter had promised to protect his identity, but if the officer had discovered the documents, Marcus's role in the investigation could be compromised. As the officer stepped away to make a call, Marcus couldn't help but wonder what would happen next. His hands were clammy, and his heart was racing. What if the officer realized the gravity of the situation and decided to take matters into his own hands? What if this one encounter ruined everything he had worked for? His career was already on the line, and now it seemed like the officer had just unknowingly added fuel to the fire. He looked around, hoping that the situation would end quickly. People on the street were still watching, some still recording the scene on their phones. The air felt thick with tension, and Marcus's thoughts were racing faster than he could process them. Every second that passed felt like an eternity. Would the officer come back with more questions? Would he try to hold Marcus longer for something that wasn't even his fault? Time seemed to slow down as Marcus waited, his mind caught in a whirlwind of uncertainty. The officer was still standing a few feet away, speaking quietly into his radio, but Marcus couldn't hear what was being said. He tried to focus, trying to steady his breathing, but it was hard to think clearly with so many questions swirling in his head. As the officer stepped away, Marcus stood there, his mind spinning with 1,000 thoughts. The situation had taken a sharp turn, and every passing second seemed to drag on longer than the last. Marcus glanced nervously at the crowd of people who had gathered around, some watching with interest, others more discreet, but all of them clearly aware that something unusual was happening. He could feel their eyes on him, some of them holding their phones out, recording the entire scene. The last thing he wanted was to become the subject of their attention, especially when he had so much to lose. The officer was still talking into his radio, his voice muffled by the distance. Marcus couldn't help but notice the change in the officer's demeanor. What had seemed like a routine check just moments ago had now transformed into something much more serious. The officer had gone from being slightly curious to clearly rattled. His body language had shifted too, from confident and authoritative to uncertain and anxious. Marcus's thoughts returned to the papers in his briefcase. He knew exactly what the officer had found. There were legal documents in there, contracts, non-disclosure agreements, and other sensitive papers that were directly tied to a whistleblower case he had been involved in. A few days earlier, Marcus had been approached by a reporter looking to expose some corporate wrongdoing, and he had agreed to help. He knew the consequences could be huge, but he also knew it was the right thing to do. Those papers weren't just ordinary files. They were evidence. But now, standing here on the street, the officer was holding the one thing Marcus had worked so hard to protect. If the officer made the wrong decision, Marcus could lose everything. He could lose his job, his reputation, and the chance to do something that mattered, to expose the truth and bring accountability to a company that had gotten away with too much. Marcus could feel the pressure building inside him. He had been calm so far, but his heart was pounding in his chest, and his mind was racing. What if the officer didn't understand the significance of what he had found? What if he made the wrong call and things went downhill from here? Marcus had to act quickly. He couldn't let this spiral out of control. He shifted his weight from one foot to the other, trying to figure out what to do next. Should he try to explain to the officer what was in the papers? Should he tell him that these were just legal documents related to his career, and there was nothing illegal or suspicious about them? Or should he remain silent and wait for the officer to make his decision, hoping that it wouldn't escalate further. The officer finally finished his call and turned back to Marcus, his expression still tense. He took a deep breath before speaking. "I'm sorry for the delay, but I need to ask you a few more questions," the officer said, his tone a little softer now, though still serious. Marcus nodded, trying to steady himself. He had no idea what the officer was thinking, but he knew one thing for sure. The next few moments would be crucial. This could go in any direction, good or bad, and he needed to be ready for whatever came next. "Are you carrying anything else that I should know about?" the officer asked, his eyes scanning Marcus's face as though he were searching for something. Anything that could explain what had been found in his briefcase. Marcus felt a surge of frustration rise within him, but he pushed it down. He had to remain calm. "No," he said firmly, his voice steady despite the tension. "That's everything. I'm just trying to get to an important meeting." The officer didn't immediately respond. Instead, he looked at the papers in his hands one more time, his brow furrowed as he processed the information. Marcus could see that the officer was struggling with what to do. Was he going to hand the documents back? Would he continue searching? Or was he about to ask Marcus to follow him to the station? The uncertainty hung in the air like a thick fog, making it hard to breathe. Finally, the officer spoke again, this time with more hesitation in his voice. "I'm going to have to take these with me," he said slowly, "but I'll make sure everything gets sorted out." He didn't sound fully convinced, and Marcus could tell that the officer was still grappling with what to do. The words felt like a punch to the stomach. Marcus tried to stay calm, but inside, his thoughts were in turmoil. What was going to happen now? Would the officer take the papers and report them to someone higher up? Would Marcus's entire career be in jeopardy because of this one moment? The officer stepped back, motioning for Marcus to stay where he was. "Just stay here. I'll be right back," the officer said, his voice now more apologetic. Though the situation still seemed far from over, Marcus stood frozen as the officer walked away, leaving him alone on the busy street. The world around him seemed to slow down, the sounds of traffic, chatter, and footsteps fading into a dull background hum. All he could focus on was the sinking feeling in his chest, the cold knot of anxiety tightening with every passing second. His mind raced. What just happened? The officer had said he would be right back, but Marcus knew it wouldn't be that simple. Whatever had just happened, whatever was inside his briefcase, had already set something in motion that couldn't be easily undone. His thoughts turned to the papers. Those weren't just files. They were pieces of a much bigger puzzle. They contained confidential information that could expose a corrupt company, but they also had the potential to ruin his career if they fell into the wrong hands. And now, the officer had taken them. Marcus glanced around, his eyes meeting the faces of the people who had gathered around. Some of them were still watching, their phones aimed in his direction. He could feel their eyes on him, their judgment and curiosity heavy in the air. He couldn't escape the feeling that he was now part of some public spectacle. His privacy had been violated in front of all these strangers, and it made him feel small, powerless. The officer had promised to return soon, but Marcus couldn't help but wonder how long he would actually be gone. Would he return with reinforcements? Was this going to turn into a full-blown interrogation? The uncertainty was unbearable. It felt like the ground beneath him was shifting. As he waited, Marcus tried to keep his composure. He took slow, deep breaths, focusing on calming his racing thoughts. He had been in high-pressure situations before, but nothing like this. Nothing that felt so completely out of his control. The minutes stretched on. Each one felt longer than the last. Marcus watched as people walked past him, most too preoccupied with their own lives to notice what was happening. A few glanced at him curiously, but most didn't give him a second thought. Still, the feeling of being under a microscope didn't leave him. His eyes returned to the officer, who was still out of sight. Marcus's mind kept returning to the same question. What now? The officer had been rattled by the documents. Marcus could see that in his face. The officer didn't seem like he was just going through the motions anymore. He seemed genuinely conflicted. But why? Was it because he realized the weight of what was in the briefcase? Did he know that by taking those papers, he was stepping into a bigger story than he had ever expected? Marcus tried to push those thoughts aside. He couldn't afford to get distracted by speculation. What mattered now was getting the documents back. If he didn't act quickly, everything could spiral out of control. The more time the officer spent on whatever he was doing, the more likely it was that Marcus's life would be completely upended. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, the officer reappeared. His face was serious, but there was a hint of tension around his eyes. He walked towards Marcus slowly, his steps deliberate. "Okay," the officer said, stopping just in front of Marcus. "I've made a call to my supervisor, and they've advised me to return the documents. But I need you to understand something. This isn't over. There's more going on here than you think." Marcus felt a wave of relief wash over him, but it was quickly replaced by confusion. What did the officer mean by that? "I don't understand," Marcus said, his voice steady, though his mind was spinning. "What more could there be? I just need my papers back." The officer looked at him carefully, as though trying to gauge whether Marcus was telling the truth. "I can't explain everything right now, but I need you to be careful," the officer warned. "There's a lot at play here, and it's bigger than just you or me." Marcus felt his stomach tighten. What was the officer talking about? The situation had already spiraled out of control, and now it sounded like there were even more layers to it. What had Marcus gotten himself involved in? And how much danger was he really in? The officer handed over the briefcase, but Marcus didn't feel a sense of victory. The weight of it in his hands felt different now. He wasn't just holding legal papers anymore. He was holding onto something that could change his life in ways he didn't fully understand yet. Marcus stood there, holding his briefcase with trembling hands. The officer had walked away, and the crowd around him had slowly begun to disperse, their curiosity satisfied for the moment. But Marcus couldn't shake the feeling that his life had just taken a turn he couldn't undo. The officer's cryptic words echoed in his mind. "It's bigger than just you or me." What did that mean? What had he just stumbled into? The documents in his briefcase had already been a heavy burden to carry, but now they felt like a ticking time bomb. If the officer had found something more, something larger, Marcus could no longer ignore the gravity of the situation. His hands were clammy as he gripped the handle tighter. He started to walk again, his pace quickening. He needed to get to the meeting, the one that had seemed so important just hours ago. But now, every step felt like it was leading him further away from the normal life he had known. The weight of the briefcase was like a reminder of everything at stake: his career, his future, his sense of security. The questions swirling in his mind were too many to count, and he couldn't focus on anything but the nagging feeling that something was wrong. He found himself in front of a small cafe, its warm lights spilling out onto the sidewalk. The hustle and bustle of the city seemed distant now, almost muffled by the chaos in his mind. Marcus paused for a moment, looking down at the briefcase in his hands. He needed a moment to think. He stepped into the cafe, the soft chime of the door announcing his entrance. The place was quiet, a few people seated at tables, sipping coffee and chatting quietly. The smell of fresh pastries and brewed coffee filled the air, but Marcus couldn't enjoy it. He was too wrapped up in his own thoughts. He found an empty table by the window and sat down, still clutching the briefcase. His mind kept racing, replaying the encounter with the officer. What had he meant by "it's bigger than just you or me"? Was it a warning? A threat? Or was it just an officer who didn't know how to handle the situation? Marcus looked out the window, his reflection staring back at him. He saw a man who had once felt confident and in control, someone who had worked tirelessly to build a career. But now, the person in the reflection seemed distant, almost like a stranger. He wasn't sure who he was anymore, or where this was all going. He didn't know who he could trust. His phone buzzed, breaking him from his thoughts. He fished it out of his pocket and glanced at the screen. A message from an unknown number. He opened it quickly, his fingers trembling. "You need to be careful. They're watching. You're not alone in this." Marcus's heart skipped a beat. Who was this? How did they know? The message sent a chill down his spine. His first instinct was to ignore it, to pretend it wasn't there. But something told him that doing so would only make things worse. He couldn't afford to be naive anymore. His mind raced. Who could have sent the message? Was it the officer? The reporter? Someone else entirely? And if so, what did they mean by "they're watching"? Was this all part of some larger scheme? His thoughts were interrupted by the sound of footsteps approaching. A waiter appeared at his side, smiling politely. "Can I get you anything else, sir?" they asked. Marcus shook his head absent-mindedly, barely registering the question. His eyes were still fixed on the phone in his hands. The waiter seemed to sense the tension in the air and quickly walked away. Marcus put his phone down on the table, trying to gather his thoughts. He couldn't sit here forever. He had to figure out what to do next, but he felt trapped. His career, his reputation, and even his safety felt as if they were hanging by a thread. The officer had given him back the briefcase, but had it really ended there? The officer had warned him, but was it a real warning or just an offhand comment? Marcus couldn't shake the feeling that there was something more going on. Someone knew about the documents in his briefcase, and they were actively keeping an eye on him. But why? He took a deep breath, trying to steady his nerves. He couldn't waste any more time. He needed to get to the meeting, to confront whatever was coming his way. But the closer he got, the more he realized just how unprepared he was for whatever lay ahead. The man who had walked into the cafe just an hour ago, certain about his future, was gone. Now Marcus was walking into the unknown, unsure of who would be waiting for him. Marcus stepped out of the cafe, his heart pounding in his chest. The message on his phone still lingered in his mind. "You need to be careful. They're watching. You're not alone in this." The words seemed to echo in his ears as he walked, his footsteps heavy on the pavement. It felt as though this city had shifted beneath him, the familiar streets now unfamiliar and filled with hidden dangers. His thoughts were jumbled, and he couldn't seem to focus on anything for long. The meeting was still on his mind, the one he had planned for all week. But now it felt irrelevant. What good was a meeting when his entire life seemed to be unraveling around him? The officer had found the documents. Someone else had sent him a warning. Who was involved in all this, and how much danger was he in? He couldn't answer those questions, and the uncertainty was gnawing at him. As he walked, his eyes scanned the crowd, almost instinctively. The feeling of being watched was overwhelming. He could swear there were eyes on him from every direction, even though he couldn't see anyone who seemed suspicious. People went about their day, passing him by without a second glance, but the sense of paranoia was suffocating. It was like there was a shadow following him, and no matter how quickly he moved, it was always there, just behind him. He turned a corner, hoping the change in direction would give him some sense of control, but nothing felt normal. The street was busier now, the lunchtime rush filling the sidewalks with people. He adjusted his grip on the briefcase, his fingers tight against the handle. The documents inside still seemed to weigh more than they should, a constant reminder of how much was riding on what happened next. Marcus glanced at his phone again, his fingers hovering over the screen. Should he respond to the mysterious message? Part of him wanted to ignore it, to pretend it was nothing. But the other part of him, the part that understood how much was at stake, knew that ignoring it could be a mistake. If someone was watching him, someone who knew about the documents and the investigation, then he couldn't afford to make the wrong move. His phone buzzed again, snapping him from his thoughts. Another message from the same unknown number. This time, the words were clearer. "Trust no one. Everyone has their own agenda. Be careful where you go next. The walls are closing in." Marcus's breath caught in his throat. What did that mean? Who was sending him these warnings, and why now, when things were already spiraling out of control? Was it possible that someone knew what he was involved in, that they were aware of the danger he was in? He could feel his pulse quickening. This was getting worse, not better. His instincts were telling him to turn back, to call off the meeting, to find a way to protect himself. But he couldn't. He couldn't just walk away now, not when so much had already happened. Marcus stopped at a crosswalk, waiting for the light to change. His mind was racing, trying to make sense of everything. The officer's warning, the cryptic messages, the weight of the briefcase. Nothing made sense. Who could be involved in all this? What if he had unknowingly gotten too close to something dangerous? Something much bigger than he had ever realized. The light turned green, and Marcus crossed the street, moving toward the building where his meeting was taking place. It was a large, glass-fronted office building, its modern design standing in sharp contrast to the older buildings surrounding it. As he neared the entrance, Marcus couldn't shake the feeling that someone was following him. His heart skipped a beat, and he turned quickly, scanning the crowd. But there was no one. "Get a grip," he told himself. "You're just imagining things." But as he entered the building and made his way toward the elevator, he couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. The elevator doors opened with a soft chime, and Marcus stepped inside, pressing the button for the top floor. As the doors closed, he glanced around nervously. No one else was in the elevator, but he felt like he wasn't alone. The ride up felt too long, the silence inside the elevator oppressive. When the doors finally opened, Marcus stepped out into the sleek, modern lobby. The room was nearly empty, save for a few people seated in the waiting area. He walked toward the receptionist, but as soon as he stepped forward, something stopped him. He had been here dozens of times before, but today it felt different. The air felt thicker, the space more foreboding. The receptionist smiled politely, but Marcus could see the faintest flicker of something in her eyes. A recognition, perhaps, or maybe just a fleeting moment of doubt. But it was enough to make him pause. Marcus stepped into the meeting room, the weight of the briefcase in his hand feeling like an anchor. The door closed softly behind him, cutting off the sounds of the busy office building. Inside, the room was sleek and modern, with large windows offering a view of the city skyline. A long conference table sat in the center, surrounded by chairs, but no one was seated at the table. The room was empty, except for one person standing near the window. The figure turned slowly as Marcus entered, and for a moment, he felt his heart skip a beat. It was a man he recognized, someone who had been a part of his professional world for years. David Coleman, a senior executive at the company Marcus worked for, someone who held a lot of power, someone who, until this moment, had always seemed untouchable. "Marcus," David said, his voice calm but with an edge of something else, something Marcus couldn't quite place. "Glad you could make it." Marcus forced a smile, trying to keep his composure. "I didn't have much of a choice, did I?" David chuckled, but it wasn't a friendly sound. "No, I suppose not." He paused, his eyes narrowing slightly. "I've been keeping an eye on you, Marcus, and I have to say, I'm impressed." Marcus's mind raced. Keeping an eye on him? How? Why? The last few hours had been a blur of confusion and unease, and now, standing in front of one of the most powerful people in his company, everything felt even more overwhelming. He had no idea what was going on or what David's intentions were, but one thing was clear. This meeting was not going to go as he had expected. David walked toward the table, his steps measured and deliberate. "I know what you've been working on," he continued, his tone low. "The documents you have. The ones that could change everything." Marcus froze. How much did David know? Was this all about the whistleblower case? Had David somehow discovered his involvement? The fear crept up his spine again, but he pushed it down. He couldn't show weakness now. "You've been very careful," David said, sitting down at the table. "But not careful enough. You see, Marcus, I've been involved in this business for a long time, and I know how to spot people like you. People who think they can make a difference. People who think they can change things. He leaned forward, his eyes locking with Marcus. "But you're out of your depth." Marcus swallowed hard, trying to steady his breathing. This was it, the moment he had been dreading. He had walked into this room not knowing what to expect, but now he realized the stakes were higher than he had imagined. This wasn't just about the documents in his briefcase. It was about everything: his career, his future, and possibly even his freedom. David continued, his voice cold and calculating. "I'm sure you've been getting a lot of attention. People have been watching you. The officer earlier today. That wasn't a coincidence. We made sure you'd be stopped, that you'd be questioned. And I'm sure you've received a few messages by now. Warnings, perhaps." Marcus's blood ran cold. He didn't know how to respond. He had suspected something was wrong, but hearing David admit it was a different matter entirely. David's smile was tight, as if he were savoring Marcus's discomfort. "You didn't think we wouldn't notice, did you? We've been keeping track of everyone involved in this little investigation of yours. The documents you have are a problem. A big problem. And now that you've walked in here, it's time to deal with it." Marcus's mind raced as he tried to process everything David was saying. He had to act fast. The walls were closing in, and he knew that if he didn't make a move, he would be trapped in this situation. The briefcase felt heavier than ever, and it was no longer just a set of legal documents. It was a symbol of the fight he was in, the fight to do what was right. But how could he fight someone like David? Someone with so much power, so many resources. Was there any way out of this? David's expression hardened as he leaned back in his chair, his fingers steepled together. "So, Marcus," he said slowly, "I have a simple choice for you. You can walk out of here and pretend none of this ever happened, or you can continue down this path and face the consequences. Believe me, the consequences will be far worse than you think." Marcus's mind was spinning. Every instinct told him to back down, to walk away, but he couldn't. Not now. Not after everything he had been through. He had to fight for what was right, no matter the cost. David studied him for a moment, as if waiting for a response. But Marcus stayed silent, his jaw clenched. He wasn't going to be intimidated.